Jamal walked down the cracked sidewalk with his backpack slung loosely over his shoulder, his mind still buzzing from the events of the day. A final bell had rung only a few minutes ago, signaling the end of another school day. And now he was just trying to make it home before the sun dipped too low behind the horizon. His sneakers tapped lightly on the concrete as he passed by rows of brick houses that had seen better days and a few cars parked crookedly along the curb. He kept his head down, not wanting to draw attention to himself. The kind of attention that could make a walk home feel like a crime even when it wasn't, but something was different today. He could feel it in his gut, like the air was charged with a kind of nervous energy that made him want to look over his shoulder again and again, but he kept walking, his pace steady, his eyes glued to the ground, hoping the feeling would pass. Maybe it was just the weather, or maybe the thoughts of his dad's high-profile job creeping back into his mind. But whatever it was, Jamal couldn't shake it. Not today, not now. As he turned the corner at the end of the block, Jamal spotted a police car parked at the intersection. Two officers sat inside, their eyes scanning the neighborhood as they usually did, but something about the way they looked at him made his heart race faster. He tried to ignore them at first, keeping his eyes straight ahead, but one of the officers shifted in his seat and rolled down the window. Jamal felt the tension rise instantly, a sharp chill spreading across his neck. "Hey kid," one of the officers called out, his voice flat and demanding. Jamal stopped in his tracks but didn't turn around, his feet frozen to the pavement. He could feel their eyes on him, like they were weighing him for something he wasn't sure of yet. The other officer got out of the car and approached him slowly, hands resting on the belt of his holster. Jamal's stomach twisted into a knot. "You got a minute?" the officer asked, his tone different now, more curious but still sharp. Jamal didn't move, just kept his head down, hoping they'd let him go, but the officer stepped closer, blocking his path. "What's your name?" the officer asked again, this time louder and more insistent. Jamal hesitated for a second before answering, just trying to keep his voice steady. "Jamal," he muttered barely above a whisper. "Jamal, what are you doing around here?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow as if something was off about the way he was standing, something he couldn't put his finger on. Yet Jamal felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His mind raced. "Just walking home," he said, keeping his voice as calm as he could. "You sure about that?" the officer asked, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Jamal felt a flicker of unease run through him. Something wasn't right here. "Yeah, just walking home," he repeated, his voice stronger now, trying to stand his ground, but the officer wasn't buying it. "We'll see about that," the officer said, suddenly more forceful. His hand reached out to grab Jamal's arm, firmly pulling him toward the side of the car. Jamal's pulse spiked, his heart thudding in his chest as the officer rifled through his backpack, pulling out books and papers with no care for what might fall to the ground. The other officer stood off to the side, eyes locked on Jamal, watching his every move as if waiting for something to happen. Jamal swallowed hard, feeling the heat of the moment press down on him. Too heavy, too close, too wrong. Jamal felt his breath quicken, his chest tightening as the officer continued to go through his backpack, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to control the panic rising in his throat, the weight of the situation crushing down on him like the heat from the midday sun, pressing against his skin. The officers weren't listening, they weren't hearing him, they were just going through his things, treating him like he was guilty of something before he even had a chance to speak for himself. One of the officers grunted in frustration as he pulled out a notebook from Jamal's bag, flipping through the pages with no regard for the effort it had taken to write down those notes, the very notes that had been his only escape during school when things felt overwhelming. "What's all this?" the officer muttered under his breath as he tossed the notebook aside with a dismissive sneer. Jamal's heart pounded faster, the anxiety curling in his stomach, now like a ball of fire. The way they were acting made him feel like he was caught in some twisted game where the rules didn't apply to him, and the more he stood there, the more trapped he felt. The officer's face was inches from his own, his breath sour and hot as he asked again, "What's your deal, kid? You got a problem with authority?" Jamal shook his head quickly. "No, sir," he managed to say, his voice barely audible despite the volume of his heartbeat thudding in his ears. "Then why don't you act like it?" the officer snapped, turning his back to Jamal for a moment as if he were trying to decide what to do next. The other officer, who had been silent up until this point, stepped forward with a scoff. "This kid's too quiet. You know that something doesn't sit right with me. You're acting suspicious for no reason," the officer said, his eyes narrowing as if the accusation itself was enough to condemn Jamal. "I'm just walking home," Jamal repeated, this time louder, more firm, trying to make them see him for who he really was, not just another kid they could push around. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officers began searching him more roughly, checking his pockets in a way that felt invasive, violating his sense of privacy, his space. The pressure of their hands on his body made him flinch despite his efforts to stay calm. One of the officers grabbed his phone from his pocket and flipped it open as though expecting to find something incriminating there. The other officer stood in the background, watching Jamal closely, a smug look on his face. "What's this?" the first officer asked, holding up the phone as if it were evidence of a crime. Jamal's stomach dropped, the tightness in his chest growing unbearable, but he didn't respond at first. The officers weren't listening to him, so what good would it do to try? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officer put the phone down with a grunt, muttering about kids these days. But Jamal didn't feel any relief, not yet. He had no idea how much longer this would last, but he knew it had already gone too far. The more they pressed, the more he could feel his fear getting the best of him, but still he stood tall, because if he didn't, who would be there to protect him? Then out of nowhere, a black SUV came screeching to a halt just a few feet away, the sound of tires on asphalt cutting through the tense air. The doors flung open and out stepped a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his face stern, and his stride purposeful as he approached the officers without a word at first. Jamal's eyes widened as the man's gaze shifted toward him. The man's eyes locked onto his in an instant, and Jamal could feel the weight of recognition sink into his chest. The man's expression softened slightly as he made his way over. "You all right, son?" The man's voice was calm, but his eyes held an intensity that made the officers freeze in place, like they were waiting for a signal. Jamal's mouth went dry as he realized who the man was. It was his father, the chief of police. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as his father approached him, his tall figure cutting through the tension like a knife. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The chief of police didn't look at them, not yet. His eyes were fixed on Jamal, and for a moment everything else seemed to blur out of focus. Jamal felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over him as his father reached him, standing tall and unyielding, his presence commanding. "Jamal, you okay?" The chief's voice was low but firm, his gaze never leaving his son's face. Jamal nodded slowly, not trusting his own voice, not sure what to say after everything that had just happened. He didn't know if he should feel grateful or furious that his father was here. His presence was enough to stop the officers in their tracks, but that didn't make what they had done any less wrong. The chief's eyes finally flicked to the two officers still standing in place, their faces pale as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. One of the officers opened his mouth to speak, but his words caught in his throat. "What's going on here?" the chief asked, his tone cold, and clipped his gaze, sweeping from one officer to the other. As he waited for an explanation, the officers shifted uncomfortably under his stare. One of them mumbled something about a suspicious individual, and the other started to explain the search, but the chief held up a hand, cutting them off. "You know exactly who this is," the chief said, his voice booming, now causing the officers to falter as they realized their blunder. They had failed to recognize the boy they were harassing was not just any teenager, but the son of the chief of police. The chief turned back to Jamal, his expression softening as he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Jamal shook his head, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the encounter. "I'm fine," he said, his voice shaky but determined, still trying to process what had just happened. His father's eyes narrowed as he looked at the officers again. "Do you two realize what you've done?" The chief's voice was low but menacing now. The officers shifted nervously, their earlier bravado evaporating into the air. One of the officers stammered out an apology, but the chief didn't seem to care. His focus was solely on his son now, as if trying to gauge the full extent of the damage. "Jamal, you don't have to deal with this," he said, his tone softer now. "I'm sorry you had to go through this." The apology was brief, but it was enough to make Jamal feel a little less exposed, even though the embarrassment still burned in his chest. The officers began to mumble their apologies awkwardly, but the chief ignored them, turning his attention fully to Jamal again. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice taking on a protective edge as he began guiding Jamal toward the SUV with a firmness that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further nonsense from these officers. As they walked toward the car, Jamal couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. The relief of being with his father didn't erase the anger and humiliation he felt at the way he had been treated by the very people who were supposed to protect him. His mind raced with questions about how it had all spiraled so quickly, but for now he was just grateful that his father was here to take him home. But as the SUV doors slammed shut behind them and the car pulled away, Jamal's thoughts lingered on the officers standing in the street, their heads lowered in shame. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and now the consequences of their actions were about to unfold in a way they could never have anticipated. As the SUV sped away, Jamal leaned back in his seat, his mind still buzzing with the events that had just unfolded. The tension in the air was palpable as his father's silence hung heavy between them. The city streets passed by in a blur as the car weaved through traffic. Jamal couldn't help but replay the moment in his head over and over, the fear, the confusion, the feeling of being singled out for something he had no control over. His father didn't say a word at first, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as if he were holding back a storm of his own. Jamal knew better than to speak just yet. He could feel the anger radiating off his father in waves, the kind of anger that came from a place of deep frustration. After a long pause, the chief of police finally spoke, his voice tight and controlled. "You're all right, Jamal," the chief said, looking over at his son, his eyes softening, but his face still tense. Jamal nodded, not sure how to respond. The words felt too heavy to say out loud. "I'm fine," he muttered again, but it didn't feel true, not really, not after what had just happened. The weight of the officer's actions still hung around him like a shadow. The chief let out a long breath before speaking again. "You shouldn't have had to go through that, son. No one should ever treat you like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion, the words almost breaking through the veneer of control he'd been holding onto all this time. Jamal remained silent, his eyes focused out the window as the city passed by. He didn't know how to respond to that. It was all too much, too overwhelming. He felt like he was caught in some kind of nightmare where the rules didn't apply to him, where just being who he was meant he was always in the wrong. But this wasn't just about him. He knew that his father's words were a reminder that something larger was at play, something that Jamal couldn't fully grasp but felt deeply in his bones. The officers were wrong, he thought, but what did that really mean in a world where the rules of right and wrong were always changing depending on who you were? As the SUV turned onto a quieter road, his father's voice broke through his thoughts again. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed, Jamal," the chief said, his voice steady, but the intensity behind it was undeniable. "We're going to make sure those officers are held accountable for what they did." Jamal turned his head to look at his father, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what to feel at that moment. Part of him wanted to feel relief that his father was going to do something about this, but another part of him wondered if anything would truly change, if this would just be another case swept under the rug. But his father's eyes were locked on the road ahead, determined and unwavering. Jamal knew that his father wasn't going to let this go quietly. The car pulled into the driveway of their home and the engine shut off, but neither of them moved for a moment, the weight of everything that had just happened still hanging in the air between them. Finally, his father spoke again, this time softer. "We'll figure this out together, Jamal, but I want you to know I'm proud of you for keeping your head in that situation, even when they were pushing you," he said, his voice thick with pride. But Jamal couldn't help but wonder if anyone else would have been treated that way, if anyone else would have had to endure what he did just because of the color of his skin. He didn't answer. Instead, he just nodded and stepped out of the car, slowly feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. Jamal stepped out of the SUV, his legs feeling heavy as he made his way up the driveway to the front door. The cool evening air did little to calm the storm that was brewing inside him. His mind was still spinning from the encounter, the officers, the tension, the realization that his whole life could change in the blink of an eye. He reached for the door handle, paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the knob. He wasn't sure he was ready to walk into the house to face his mother, to explain what had happened. He didn't want to see the worry in her eyes, the questions he wasn't sure he could answer. The door opened before he could reach for it, and his mother stood there, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Jamal, what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of worry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out at first. He couldn't find a way to explain what he had just gone through, what had just happened to him, the injustice of it all. His father stepped up behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder with a look of determination in his eyes. "It's okay," his father said, his voice firm. "We'll talk about it, but not right now, not here." Jamal's mother nodded silently, stepping aside to let them in, but Jamal could feel the weight of her gaze following him as he walked past her into the house. They all sat down in the living room, the silence thick with anticipation. Jamal's mother was the first to speak again, but her voice was softer now. "So what happened?" she asked, her eyes shifting between Jamal and his husband. Jamal looked at his father, unsure of what to say at first. It felt like his words weren't enough to explain everything that had happened. His father took over, speaking with quiet authority. Two officers stopped Jamal on the street and accused him of being suspicious for no reason. His father began, his tone even and controlled. Jamal tried to tune out the rest of the words. He could hear his father explaining what had occurred, how the officers had searched him without cause, how they had assumed guilt based on nothing but the color of his skin. His mother's face fell as the words sank in. She closed her eyes for a moment before looking back at Jamal, her voice quiet but filled with hurt. "I'm so sorry, Jamal," she said, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the right words to make it better, but there were none. Jamal wanted to speak to tell them he was fine, but the truth was he wasn't fine, not really, not after everything that had just happened. He felt a mixture of anger and shame swirling inside him like a storm that wouldn't pass. His father reached over and placed a hand on his knee gently. "We're going to make sure those officers answer for what they did, Jamal," his father said, his voice strong but comforting. "I'll make sure of it." Jamal nodded, but it didn't bring him any comfort, not yet, not when he still felt like the world was closing in around him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Now we fight," his father replied, his eyes locking with his. Jamal's gaze was intense and unwavering. He could see the fire in his father's eyes, the determination that had always been there, but somehow now it felt more personal, more urgent. "We fight for what's right, Jamal," his father said firmly, "and we don't stop until they understand how wrong they were." The next morning, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Even though it was only a few hours since the incident, he couldn't go back to school. Not yet. The humiliation still burned in his chest like an open wound. He sat in his room, staring at his phone, the notifications from friends piling up. But he couldn't bring himself to check them. He knew they were all asking the same thing. What had happened with the cops? Why did they stop you? He didn't feel ready to explain, not yet, not until he figured out how to make sense of what had happened, the way everything had spun out of control so quickly. Downstairs he could hear his mother and father talking in hushed tones. His father's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it, as if the weight of what they were about to do was already pressing down on him. Jamal had never seen his father like this before. Usually the chief of police was a figure of authority, a man whose word held weight, whose every decision was scrutinized, but now he could hear the frustration and anger in his voice as he discussed what steps to take next. The doorbell rang, suddenly breaking the silence. Jamal jumped up from his bed and made his way downstairs slowly. He wasn't sure who it was, but the feeling in his gut told him it was important. He reached the door and opened it to find two detectives standing on the porch. They were both dressed in plain clothes, their expressions serious and professional. Jamal's father had called ahead, and they were here to take statements, they explained. One of the detectives held out a clipboard with a few forms and papers. "We need your statement, Jamal," the detective said, his voice low but not unkind. Jamal felt his heart race again as he stepped aside to let them in. As they walked into the living room, Jamal could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him even more. These were the detectives, the people who would be responsible for investigating what had happened. The officers' actions were now officially being questioned. His father was already sitting at the table waiting for them, his face set in determination as he spoke quietly to the detectives. "What happened yesterday can't happen again," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. The detectives nodded in agreement, but Jamal could see the tension in their faces. They knew how serious this was, how high the stakes were. Jamal sat down at the table across from his father, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the chair, his mind swirling with everything he had witnessed: the officers, the humiliation, the way they had treated him for no reason at all. The detective began asking him questions about the encounter, and Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach with every answer he gave, his voice shaky at times, but he told them everything he could remember. He explained how they had stopped him without cause, how they had accused him of being suspicious just because he was walking home from school, how they had searched him as if he was a criminal. He told them how one officer had been particularly aggressive, how the other had just stood by without saying a word. The whole situation felt surreal as he spoke it out loud, like it was happening to someone else and not to him. When he finished, the detective took notes and asked a few more questions, but Jamal felt like he was fading into the background, the words leaving his mouth without feeling like they mattered. They had already happened, and now all he could do was watch and hope that someone would take action. His father sat quietly next to him, his hand resting on the table, but Jamal could feel the weight of his presence, the quiet strength that came from knowing his father was on his side, that he would fight for him no matter what. As the detectives left, his father gave him a small nod, but there was no smile, no reassurance, just a quiet understanding that this was only the beginning. Days passed and Jamal's world felt like it had shifted into a place he didn't fully recognize. The mornings were quieter now, his thoughts clouded by everything that had happened, the weight of what he'd experienced still pressing down on him. Every time he stepped outside, every time he caught sight of a police car, it felt like his body was on high alert, but there was no escaping it, no way to ignore what had occurred. At school things were different too. Whispers followed him through the hallways, the rumor mill working overtime as his classmates tried to piece together the story. Most of them had heard about the encounter with the cops, but Jamal didn't want to talk about it, not yet. He didn't want to answer questions from people who hadn't been there and couldn't understand what it felt like to have his humanity questioned like that. He kept his head down at lunch, sticking with his small group of friends who were kind enough not to ask too many questions, but he could tell they were concerned the way they glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking, the way they tried to act like everything was normal when clearly nothing was. Even his best friend Darnell, who usually joked around and kept things light, seemed distant these days. Jamal could tell Darnell wanted to talk, but Jamal wasn't ready to let anyone in, not yet. He wasn't sure what he was feeling or how to express it without it all feeling like too much. At home his parents were busy, but they always made time to check in on him. His mother would ask him if he was okay, but she always seemed worried, like she was afraid of the answer. His father was no different. The chief was doing everything in his power to ensure that the officers involved were held accountable, but there was a part of Jamal that wondered if it would even matter, if anything would change at all. He was scared of the consequences of all of this and terrified of the idea that his life might never feel the same again. Jamal sat in his room one afternoon scrolling through his phone when an email notification popped up. It was from the detective who had taken his statement a few days ago. He clicked on it without thinking and found a short message saying that the department had completed its initial investigation into the incident and they were recommending disciplinary action against the 2 officers involved. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he read the email over and over, trying to process what it meant. The words were familiar, but they didn't feel real at first. Disciplinary action meant something, but what did it really mean for the officers? What kind of punishment were they facing? Would this be enough to make them realize what they'd done? His mind raced as he thought about the implications of the email. For a long time he stared at the screen before he picked up the phone to call his father. When his father answered, Jamal's voice was quiet but firm. "Dad, what does it really mean when they say disciplinary action? What happens now?" There was a pause before his father's voice came through the line, steady and calm. "It means they'll be investigated, and depending on the findings, there could be consequences, Jamal, but this is just the start. It's not over yet." Jamal exhaled slowly, trying to process the words. "What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" "It will, Jamal," his father said, his voice unwavering. "I promise you it will." The next few days felt like an endless waiting game for Jamal. Time dragged on as the investigation into the 2 officers continued, but every day felt heavier than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would change, that the system would protect them and sweep it all under the rug like so many things before. At school, Jamal's silence grew more noticeable. The whispers that followed him were no longer just rumors, but assumptions that he was different now somehow changed, as if the encounter had branded him in a way that couldn't be erased even by the support of his father, the chief of police. Darnell tried to talk to him one afternoon after school. Jamal was sitting on the bleachers staring out at the empty field when Darnell came up to him, his face full of concern. "Yo man, you good?" Darnell asked, sitting down next to Jamal. The sound of his voice pulled Jamal out of his thoughts for a second. "I'm alright," Jamal said, his voice flat, but Darnell could see through it, the way his eyes were distant, like he was somewhere else. "Man, this whole thing is crazy," Darnell continued. "You know, you don't have to carry this by yourself, right?" Jamal nodded slowly, but didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. There was a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away, but he couldn't bring himself to explain how heavy everything felt, how even though his father was fighting for justice, he felt like he was losing something important in the process. Darnell sighed and leaned back against the bleachers, taking a deep breath, like he was trying to think of the right words to say, but nothing came. Jamal appreciated the effort, but it didn't help. He wasn't sure anything could help right now. Meanwhile, at home things were just as tense. His mother kept trying to comfort him, but Jamal could see the strain in her eyes. She was worried about him more than she let on, but she knew better than to press him too hard. His father, on the other hand, was constantly busy, his phone ringing constantly with calls from the department or the press, but Jamal could feel the distance between them too. Even though his father was doing everything he could to make sure the officers were held accountable, Jamal could sense the quiet frustration in him, the feeling of being trapped in a system that wasn't always on his side. Jamal kept coming back to the question, what did it really mean for things to change when everything felt so stuck? One night after dinner, his father sat down with him in the living room. Jamal could see the weight of the situation in his father's eyes as he sat across from him. "Son, I know you've been struggling with all of this, and I want you to know that I'm doing everything in my power to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed, but it's going to take time." Jamal nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything. He didn't want to hear more promises. He didn't want to hear that things would be different when the truth was they were still the same. The next morning, Jamal woke up to another email from the department. It was a follow-up on the investigation, and this time it came with an official statement from the police chief announcing that both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending further review. Jamal felt a small flicker of something inside him, but it was hard to tell if it was hope or something else. The feeling of victory was muted. It didn't feel like enough, but it was something, and maybe that was all he could hold onto for now. The idea that maybe, just maybe, things could change if enough people were willing to stand up for what was right. He sat there in silence, staring at the screen, thinking about how far this had come and how much further they had to go before things would really be different. The days following the announcement of the officer's administrative leave felt like they were moving at a slower pace than ever. Jamal sat in his room, often staring out the window, but no matter how many times he looked at the world outside, it still felt distant and surreal. Everything felt different. The usual rhythms of his life now seemed out of sync, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Darnell. "Hey man, we still on for the weekend? I know you're dealing with a lot, but maybe a little distraction would help." Jamal stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Yeah, I'm good," he typed back, but his mind wasn't really on the plans for the weekend. Not now. He wanted to say something else, to tell Darnell that he wasn't really okay, that the distractions weren't working, but he didn't have the words. He could hear his father talking downstairs in the kitchen, his voice rising and falling in conversation with one of the department officials. Jamal could tell the investigation was moving forward, but it felt like each new update only left him with more questions. He wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore, what real change meant when everything felt so broken. Later that evening, his father came into his room without knocking. The door creaked open slowly, and Jamal looked up to find his father standing there watching him for a moment. "You doing all right, son?" his father asked, his voice soft but tinged with concern. Jamal didn't know how to answer. He could see the worry in his father's eyes, the concern that had never left but now felt even more pronounced. "I'm fine," Jamal said quietly. It was a lie, but it was the easiest thing to say. His father didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. He stepped further into the room and sat down on the bed beside Jamal. "You know you don't have to carry all of this by yourself, right?" he said after a long silence. Jamal looked over at him, feeling the weight of the words. "I don't know what to do with it all," Jamal admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what happens next, or if it even matters. I'm just tired of feeling like none of this is ever going to change." His father sighed and ran a hand over his face as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I know it's hard to see the way forward when you're in the middle of it, but Jamal, we're not doing this alone. I'm here for you, your mother's here for you, and we're fighting every day to make sure the people who hurt you answer for it." Jamal felt a wave of emotion rise up in him, but he held it back. His father's words were comforting, but they didn't make everything go away. They didn't make the fear or the anger or the frustration disappear. "I know you're doing your best, Dad, but I just don't know if it's enough," he said, his voice breaking slightly. His father was quiet for a long time, his hand resting on Jamal's shoulder. "It will be enough, son," his father said finally, his voice steady and full of conviction. "We'll keep fighting for you and for everyone who needs a voice, even when it feels like the fight is impossible. We won't give up." Jamal nodded, even though he wasn't sure he believed it. Not yet, not when it felt like everything around him was constantly shifting and nothing ever stayed the same. But his father's words gave him something to hold on to, something small but real in a world that seemed determined to pull everything apart. "I'm proud of you," his father added softly, "proud of the way you've handled all of this." Jamal felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't speak. Instead, he just nodded again and sat in the quiet with his father, wondering how long it would take for things to truly change. The next few days were a blur for Jamal. The weight of everything still sat heavy on his chest. Even as the investigation continued, he felt like he was caught in the middle of something too big to fully understand. Every time he opened his phone, every time he saw the headlines or heard people talk about what happened, he couldn't help but feel disconnected, like it was happening to someone else. At school, the atmosphere was tense. Even though no one directly confronted him, it was like the air around him had thickened, and everyone was waiting for something to happen. But no one knew what that something would be. Jamal felt like he was waiting too, but for what he wasn't sure. One afternoon during gym class, Darnell finally caught up with him again. "Yo, you've been kinda distant, man," Darnell said as he tossed the basketball up and down, his fingers grazing the ball rhythmically. Jamal could see the concern in his eyes, but also the frustration. Jamal turned toward his friend, watching him carefully, but he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. He couldn't find the words that would make sense of it all. "I'm just tired, man," Jamal admitted finally, his voice quieter than usual. "Tired of everything, just tired of feeling like I can't do anything right, tired of being seen like I'm a problem for just existing." Darnell nodded but didn't say anything at first. Jamal could tell he was struggling to find the right response. "You know I got your back, right?" Darnell said finally, his voice low but firm and his eyes locked on Jamal's. "Don't ever feel like you have to go through this by yourself, man. Jamal smiled weakly, but the feeling didn't reach his eyes. Instead, he just nodded and turned back to the basketball court as if he could escape the conversation, or maybe just escape how he felt for a moment. Later that night, as Jamal sat in the kitchen with his parents, his father's phone rang again, and his mother excused herself to answer it, leaving the two of them alone. Jamal had been trying to ignore the tension in the air, but it was impossible. His father's demeanor had shifted over the past few days. He was even more focused on the investigation now, even more determined to make sure the officers were held accountable, but Jamal could see the toll it was taking on him. "Dad, you good?" Jamal asked, his voice hesitant, but his father just waved it off and gave him a small smile. "Yeah, I'm good, son, just a lot of moving pieces right now, trying to get things to a place where we can take real action," he said, but Jamal could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "It's not just about them anymore, is it?" Jamal asked, his voice soft as he watched his father's expression shift for a second. "What do you mean?" his father asked, looking at him curiously. "It's not just about getting justice for me anymore, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else, making sure it changes for good," Jamal said, his voice growing steadier as the words came out. "It's bigger than just one incident, it's about changing the way people see things and the way they act, because it can't just be about me." His father looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words, and then nodded slowly. "You're right, son, it's bigger than just this one situation, it's about more than just getting these officers to answer for what they did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to change the system itself." Jamal sat there in silence, letting the weight of his father's words sink in. He wasn't sure what that kind of change would look like, or if it was even possible, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe that was the first step, maybe that was all they could do for now. They sat together in the quiet for a while, not saying anything more, but both of them understanding that this fight was far from over. The following week was full of meetings and late nights for Jamal's father. The calls kept coming, the pressure from his colleagues, and the media seemed to grow by the day. But despite all of it, his father remained resolute, determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion. Jamal couldn't help but feel like he was on the outside looking in. Everything seemed to be moving around him, but he couldn't find a way to pluck himself back into it. His mind was still reeling from everything he had experienced, the emotional toll of that day still hanging over him. He couldn't go a day without thinking about what had happened, how quickly things had escalated, how easily his life had been put on the line just because of how he looked to people who had no idea who he really was. At school, things had started to settle into a new kind of normal, but it didn't feel real. The whispers were quieter now, but they were still there. The stares and the uncomfortable silences whenever he walked by groups of students still lingered like an invisible weight. Jamal walked the halls with his head down, trying to ignore it all, but it was hard. It was hard to ignore the way things had shifted. It was hard to pretend like everything was okay when he knew it wasn't. Darnell tried to talk to him more often, trying to pull him out of his shell, but Jamal wasn't sure he could go back to the way things were before. Even though Darnell's presence was comforting, it couldn't take away the feeling of unease that settled in his chest every time he saw the police lights or heard the distant hum of sirens. One evening, Jamal sat in his room scrolling through the news on his phone when he saw a headline that made his stomach tighten. The officers involved in his case were finally being publicly named, and the press was starting to pick up on the story. His name was mentioned in the article as a victim, but he felt like there was no longer any separation between him and the story. It felt too personal now. He clicked on the article and read through the details. The facts of what had happened were all there, but there was something about reading it from the outside in that felt even more jarring than when it had first happened. The story painted him as another statistic, another black teenager caught in the crossfire of a broken system, and he didn't know how to feel about it. He had been hoping that maybe it would be different this time, that maybe this would be the moment where things finally changed, but all he saw in the article was the same old narrative, the same cycle of police brutality and injustice. He slammed his phone down on the desk and stood up, pacing around the room, trying to shake off the anger that had started to rise in his chest, but it wouldn't go away. The door to his room opened and his father walked in, looking at him with concern. "Jamal, what's wrong?" his father asked, noticing the tension in his son's posture. Jamal didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know how to make sense of the frustration that was building inside him. "They're making it about the story and not about the truth," Jamal said, his voice tight. "The story they're telling is the same old one, and it doesn't matter that I'm not just another victim. It doesn't matter that I'm more than just this." His father looked at him for a long moment and then walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, son, I know," his father said softly, "but you're not just a story. You're the one who's going to change the narrative, you and people like you who refuse to let the truth be forgotten." Jamal looked up at his father, seeing the determination in his eyes, and for the first time in a while he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't all lost, maybe there was still a chance for real change even if it felt impossible. The weeks passed and the pressure on Jamal's family only intensified. The investigation was still ongoing and the officers involved were being scrutinized, but there was still no clear resolution. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed, but inside Jamal's house everything was different. Jamal could see it in his father's eyes, the exhaustion that never seemed to fade, and the quiet frustration that lingered beneath his calm exterior. His father was determined to see this through, but it was starting to feel like the fight was wearing him down. Jamal tried to focus on school, but it was hard to concentrate on anything when the events of the past few weeks kept coming back to him over and over again, when he found himself wondering whether anything would truly change. One afternoon after school, Jamal sat on the porch with Darnell and a few of his other friends. They were talking about the weekend and making plans for the upcoming summer break, but Jamal wasn't really listening. His thoughts kept drifting back to the case and the constant pressure that seemed to be on his family's shoulders. "Yo man," Darnell said, snapping Jamal out of his thoughts. "You've been kinda distant lately. Everything cool?" Jamal sighed and leaned back in his chair. "And just trying to figure out what comes next," he said, his voice quiet. "The truth is I'm not sure what to think anymore." Darnell nodded but didn't push. He knew Jamal was going through something that no one could really understand. "It's gonna be okay," Darnell said after a moment, even though Jamal could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Jamal didn't respond. Instead, he just stared out at the horizon as if the answers were somewhere in the distance waiting for him to find them. That evening when he got home, Jamal found his father sitting in the living room staring at the TV, but not really watching it. His mind seemed a million miles away. Jamal hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. "Dad?" His father turned his head and smiled weakly. "It's been a long day, huh?" Jamal nodded silently and sat down next to him. "I just don't know if anything is going to change," he said quietly. "I don't know if we're ever going to make a difference." His father looked at him for a long time before answering, "You know, change doesn't happen overnight, Jamal. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Jamal looked at his father, seeing the weariness in his eyes, but also the quiet strength that still remained. "I know it's hard, son," his father continued, "but what you're going through right now matters more than you can imagine, because it's not just about what happened to you, it's about the millions of people who've been treated the same way for far too long." Jamal nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his father's words. It was hard to see the bigger picture when it felt like everything was happening to him, but he knew his father was right. "You're not alone in this, Jamal," his father said, his voice firm. "You've got a family behind you and a whole community that's standing with you, even if you can't always see it." Jamal sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the quiet support that surrounded him, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change if enough people were willing to fight for it. The fight wasn't over yet, and the road ahead would be long and difficult, but Jamal knew that he wasn't walking it alone, and that made all the difference in the world. As the days went by, Jamal found himself standing at the edge of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about the two officers and their wrongdoings. It was about the world that kept turning while people like him were left in the margins. It was about a system that had been built on silence and fear, and Jamal couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. But something inside him had shifted in ways he didn't fully understand. He began to feel a fire that had been dormant for so long burning deep in his chest. He saw the faces of people who had been through the same pain, the same humiliation, and he realized that his story wasn't just his own, it was the story of so many others who had been silenced for too long. Jamal didn't know how or when the change would come, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He couldn't stay quiet anymore. His father's words echoed in his mind. Even in the quietest moments, change didn't happen overnight, but it was always worth fighting for. The pressure continued to mount as the investigation drew closer to its final stages. The media was on fire, demanding answers. The community was on edge, watching every move the department made, and Jamal was stuck in the middle of it all, trying to hold onto the part of himself that still believed things could be better. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jamal stood outside his school, staring at the crowd of students milling around the parking lot he had been walking past when someone called his name. "Jamal." He turned to see Darnell walking toward him, his face serious, but there was something different in his eyes. "Yeah, you good?" Darnell asked, his voice low. Jamal nodded, but Darnell wasn't convinced. "Look, man, I know you're dealing with a lot, but you gotta know you're not in this alone. We all got your back." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his friend. For the first time in days, he didn't feel so alone. The weight of everything seemed to lift just a little. "I don't know what's next, but I know we're gonna make sure it counts," Jamal said, his voice steady for the first time in a long while. Darnell smiled and slapped him on the back. Let's make sure of it. In the weeks that followed, Jamal found himself in rooms he never thought he'd be in, meeting with people who wanted to hear his story, listening to the voices of those who had been fighting this fight for decades, and slowly but surely he started to believe that change wasn't just a dream, it was something they could make real if they stayed together and kept pushing. Jamal's name started to circulate more frequently in the news, but this time it wasn't just about the two officers who had wronged him, it was about the bigger issue, the systemic problems that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Jamal didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He knew the road ahead would be hard, and there would be setbacks and struggles, but he also knew that the fight was worth it, that the voices of the unheard mattered, that his story mattered. And as he looked out at the horizon one evening, feeling the weight of everything he had been through, he realized something important. He wasn't just the son of the chief of police, he was a part of something much bigger than that, a movement that would one day change the world.